That is the first thing you need to hold in your mind. Not her name, not the secret she carried, not the scar that had been burning on her collarbone for 6 months, like a small, persistent flame. Just the fact that she had told herself, the night before, that she wouldn't go. That she would sit in her small room at the end of the east corridor with her hands folded and her heart quiet and her faith intact. But he hadn't sent word. Not a single letter. Not a signal. Not even the one candle left burning in the pattern he always used when he wanted her to know he was thinking of her. One flame pushed to the left side of the sill, close enough to the draught that it flickered like a living thing. She had checked the windowsill 3 times before dawn, then twice more, then once more after that, not because she was the kind of person who kept hoping even when she should not have been. Nothing. Just cold glass and the smell of pine from the courtyard below. So she went. She told herself it was just to see. Just to stand in the upper gallery and look down at the great hall and confirm, with her own eyes, that everything was fine. That the silence meant nothing. That Varric, her Varric, the man who had pressed his lips to the crescent-shaped mark on her collarbone 6 months ago and breathed the word mine into her skin, was simply busy. Simply caught up in the ceremonies that came with a naming night. Simply had not had a chance to reach her. She told herself all of that on the long walk through the servants' corridors, past the tapestries and the torch brackets and the closed doors of guest chambers, or her feet making no sound on the stone floor. She did not believe a word of it. The great hall of Kingswell was the largest room she had ever stood in, and she had stood in it 100 times, carrying trays of herbs or bundles of dried flowers for the tables. But she had never stood in the upper gallery, pressed into the shadow of a stone pillar, looking down at a sea of silk and candlelight, and the upturned faces of thousands of wolves. The packs had come from every corner of the kingdom. She could see the colours, the deep blue of House North Vale near the western wall, the silver-stitched grey of the Coldridge elders seated in the front tier, the red sashes of the Stormridge warriors standing at attention along the far side. There were faces she did not know, and faces she recognized, though all of them tilted upward toward the dais at the end of the hall, where 7 pillars of white flame burned in iron stands as tall as men. And there, at the center of it all, stood Varric Stoneheart, Alpha King of Kingswell. She had seen him in rooms like this before, but always from a distance, always behind the blur of her own function, carrying something, delivering something, trying very hard not to stare too long. Even now, even with everything she knew, he still stopped her breath. He was broad through the shoulders in the way that came from years of actual fighting, not ceremony. His dark hair was swept back from his face, and the crown he wore was not the ornate gold and jewel thing she had expected, but something older, iron, plain, heavy-looking. His amber eyes, from even this distance, should have been warm, and they were the first thing she had noticed about him 6 months ago, when he had found her in the East Garden at midnight, gathering moonflower root, and had simply asked what it was for. They were not warm now. His face was carved from stone. His posture was rigid in the way of a man holding himself upright through will alone. His amber eyes swept the hall once, slowly, and there was something wrong in them. Something flat and distant, like a window with no light behind it. She pressed her palm flat against the stone pillar. The crescent scar on her collarbone flared with sudden heat, sharp enough to pull a small breath from her. She had felt it do that before, always in response to him, always when he was close. Her wolf, dormant and carefully hidden her entire life. They stirred in the darkness beneath her ribs, and made a sound she had no word for. She pressed her other hand, very gently, to her lower abdomen. She had found out 3 weeks ago. She had sat with the knowledge for 3 weeks, turning it over in her palms like something fragile, something that could shatter if she held it wrong. She had planned to tell him tonight, after the ceremony, in the quiet. She had rehearsed the words. Now she watched 5 women ascend the dais in white. They were the daughters of the kingdom's most powerful houses, selected and presented to the Alpha King for the formal choosing, the ancient ceremony that would bind the next queen to the throne. She knew their names. Everyone in Kingswell knew their names. She had spent 6 months telling herself it did not matter, that the choosing was politics, that what she and Varric had was something else, something that existed outside of ceremony and title, and the careful calculations of powerful houses. At the center of the 5, pale-haired and cold-eyed and trained from birth for this exact moment, stood Lysera Ravencrest. House Ravencrest controlled the northern sea routes. They commanded thousands of wolves and more ships than the crown itself. Lysera was not simply beautiful. She was a statement, a treaty in silk, a solution to 3 different political problems at once. She knew it. Her posture said she knew it. The way she stood on that dais, chin tilted just slightly upward, was the posture of a woman who had already decided how this night would end. Velina watched Varric step forward. She stopped breathing. The crescent mark flared so hot she bit the inside of her cheek. He stopped before Lysera. The great hall went silent, the kind of silence that only thousands of held breaths can produce. Varric raised his right hand. The traditional gesture, the formal choosing. His eyes were flat. His voice was steady. I choose Lysera of House Ravencrest. The hall erupted. She did not hear it. The sound disappeared first, swallowed up into something that was not quite silence and not quite noise, but some hollow frequency between the two. Then her vision narrowed, tunneled to a single point. His face, still angled toward Lysera, still stone-carved, not looking up, not glancing toward the gallery, not searching. She watched him raise Lysera's hand to his lips, the traditional gesture of acceptance. Lysera's face broke, at last, was into something that was not quite a smile, more the controlled satisfaction of a calculation proven correct. He still did not look up. Her legs found the floor. Her hands found the corridor wall. She was moving before she had decided to move. Back through the shadows, away from the roar of celebration below, through the servants' passages that smelled of stone dust and old tallow. Her room was small and cold, and exactly as she had left it. She packed with hands that would not stop shaking. 3 dresses, her grandmother's ring, the dried herbs she kept by the bed for the nausea that had greeted every morning for 3 weeks. She folded everything into her worn travel bag with the careful, methodical movements of someone concentrating very hard on doing one small thing at a time. She paused at the frosted window. Below, the bonfires were being lit across the city. Somewhere in that hall, Varric Stoneheart was accepting congratulations from 1,000 wolves. Somewhere in that hall, his future queen was standing at his side, pale-haired and cold-eyed, and exactly where she had planned to be. Violina pressed 2 fingers to the cold glass. She did not say goodbye out loud. She simply left. She did not see the figure in the tower above the gallery, a grey-haired man with amber eyes watching her small form cross the outer courtyard, his face broken. She did not hear the sound that split the sky 6 minutes later. A howl, single, raw, shredded through with something that had no name. Not a wolf's hunting cry, not a battle call. Something from deeper than either of those. Something that had no sound until that moment, and should not have existed at all. As across the city, wolves lifted their heads. packs that had been celebrating fell silent without knowing why. Even the youngest pups, tucked in their beds, stirred in their sleep. The howl rose and then broke, and the silence it left behind was worse than the sound had been. She was already through the servants' gate. She did not hear it. Her name had not always been Velina Ashbourne. Her mother had called her Lena in those early years before the fever took her. Her father, who was a quiet man, more comfortable with soil than speech, had called her his clever one, always with a slightly baffled expression, as though he could not entirely figure out how she had happened to him. She had taken her grandmother's surname when she came to Kingswell at 16, nor trailing a reputation as a gifted herb woman, and carrying a small tin box of dried roots and the knowledge of how to use them. She had found work in the castle kitchens, then the healer's annex, and had settled into the rhythm of it. The early mornings, the careful hands, the satisfaction of watching someone's pain ease because of something she had done. She had learned quickly that the castle was a world of layers. There was the world of the great halls and the formal chambers and the polished marble floors where the powerful moved and were seen. And there was the world beneath it, the narrow corridors and the service stairs, and the rooms where the actual work of the castle was done, day after day, without ceremony. She lived in that second world. She was good at it. She liked the practicality of it, or the way the people there judged each other on the straightforward measure of whether you did your job well and whether you were decent to work beside. The mark on her collarbone had been there since childhood, a small crescent shape, faint and pale, that she had always assumed was simply a birthmark. Among wolf kind, claiming marks looked like that. The impression of a bite, crescent-shaped, left by the one who claimed you. But no one had claimed her. She had told herself, for years, that it was coincidence. She had been good at making herself invisible. Herb women were meant to be background. They moved through grand spaces, carrying trays and baskets, and no one looked at them twice. Varric Stoneheart had looked at her twice. He had looked at her at least a dozen times in the East Garden at midnight, over the course of one autumn, before he said a single word beyond that first question about moonflower root. He would appear on his evening walks, alone, always alone, which she later learned was a deliberate choice, his wolves assigned elsewhere for the hour, and they would exist in the same garden and not speak until the night they started speaking and never entirely stopped. She had known what was happening to her. She was not foolish. She had felt the pull of the bond forming, that deep resonance that wolf kind called recognition. She had also known, very clearly, what she was, a common herb woman of no house and no name worth mentioning, and what he was. She had told herself, for months, that the evenings in the garden were simply evenings in the garden. Then he had pressed his lips to the crescent-shaped mark on her collarbone, 6 months ago, that on the night of the winter solstice, in the small library that nobody used any more. He had looked at her with those warm amber eyes, and he had said mine in the quiet, careful way of a man who understood the full weight of what the word meant. She had let herself believe it. Now, walking through the dark streets of the outer city with everything she owned in one bag, she turned the memory over the way you turn a stone over and find something unexpected underneath. Not the warmth she expected. Something with edges. The scar on her collarbone still burned. It had not stopped since the moment he said Lysera's name, and she pressed her fingers to it through the wool of her cloak, and felt nothing but heat and the absence of everything she had thought was waiting for her on the other side of this night. What the gates of the outer city were open for celebrating traders and merchants. No one was watching for a single woman leaving on foot with a travel bag and a face that showed nothing. She walked through the gates. She walked north toward the coast, because north was the direction her feet chose, and she had no reason to choose differently. She walked until the bonfires behind her were only a smudge of orange against the sky, and then she walked further, and by the time the cold really settled into her bones, she had stopped feeling much of anything at all. That was perhaps the strangest part of it. She had expected. She did not know. More noise, maybe. More of the kind of pain that broke things. What she felt instead was a quietness that was almost peaceful, the way a field goes still right before a storm arrives, when every creature in it has already taken shelter and the air is simply waiting. She carried one secret in her bag and another under her heart, and she walked north toward a life she would have to build from nothing. She did not cry. Not yet. Not until the third night, huddled in the loft of a farmhouse whose owners had taken her in for the cost of a cough remedy, when the baby moved for the first time, a flutter, faint and unmistakable, and she lay in the dark with her hand pressed flat and shaking, and felt everything she had been holding back come loose at once. She cried until she could not any more. Then she got up, washed her face in the cold water from the basin, braided her dark hair back from her temples, and made a quiet, firm promise to the child that was growing in the dark. She said, "I will give you a home. I will give you a name. I will give you a life no one can take from you." She said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say, and because some promises are only real if you say them simply. Then she walked north again, toward the coast. Dunmare was a village that seemed to have been built in pieces by different people over a very long time, none of whom had coordinated with each other. It sat on a rocky lip of coast, where the fog never fully lifted. Even on bright days it gathered in the lower streets, pooling around the bases of the fishing boats that were dragged up the shingle beach and the salt-silvered door-frames of the cottages that listed slightly toward the water, as though considering whether to fall in. The people here were blunt and self-contained, and deeply suspicious of anyone new, put in the way of coastal people who had survived enough storms to know that strangers brought trouble alongside whatever they were selling. Valina had appeared in Dunmare on a grey afternoon in the first hard month of winter, thin and quiet, and carrying a bag of herbs that she set on the table of the village's only inn, and described, one by one, with a steady voice. The innkeeper, a wide woman named Berta Coldridge, who had a scar through her right eyebrow and opinions about everything, had watched her with narrowed eyes for the entirety of this presentation. Then Berta had asked, "Can you do anything about chest coughs?" Vailina had said, "Yes." 3 days later, she had a small cottage at the edge of the cliffs, whose previous occupant had died of the very chest cough Berta had mentioned. The cottage smelled of salt and old smoke, and, as after a week of Velina's herbs hanging from the rafters, something warmer. It had one main room with a hearth and a work table, a sleeping alcove barely large enough for a narrow bed, and a window that looked directly out over the water. She told Berta her name was Vael Winterbourne. A young widow, she implied, with the exact amount of details that suggested grief and the exact absence of details that suggested she would not discuss it further. Berta accepted this with a nod, the way a woman who has seen enough of the world accepts most things, not necessarily believing them, but choosing not to press. By the second month, Valina, Val, here, had become essential to Dunmare in the quiet way that skilled healers become essential to small communities. Gradually, without ceremony, or through the accumulation of small services that added up to trust. She delivered a fisherman's wife of a difficult baby on a January night that neither of them would ever forget. She set the broken arm of a boy who had fallen from the harbour wall and talked calmly to him through the whole thing while he screamed. She brewed teas for coughs and poultices for salt rash, and tinctures for the old joint ache that the cold sea air drove into everyone's bones eventually. People trusted her hands. They did not need to know her name. She was grateful for the work. The work kept her hands busy and her mind focused. And when her mind was focused, she was not thinking about the scar on her collarbone that had not faded the way it should have. Among wolf-kind, a rejected claiming mark disappeared within weeks. It was known. It was documented in every wolf lore text she had ever read, and she had read many in those quiet evenings in the Castle Healer's library before everything changed. The bond was severed, the scar vanished, and the wolves moved on with the clean efficiency of creatures who understood that survival required releasing the things that were finished. Hers had not vanished. In the first weeks, she had told herself it was simply slow. In the second month, she had told herself her wolfish nature was dormant, carefully suppressed since childhood, and perhaps that affected the bond breaking. In the third month, she had stopped making excuses, and had simply accepted the fact that the crescent mark on her collarbone was darker than the day she had left Kingswell, that it pulsed with heat on certain nights, particularly when the wind came from the east, or that it ached, not sharply, not like pain exactly, but like the ache of a hand reaching for something it cannot quite reach. She examined it 100 times. She had no explanation. The village midwife was a small, bird-like woman named Arvelda Thornwell, with clever eyes and the unsettling habit of saying things quietly that other people would have needed to shout to make their point. She had been helping Vilena with deliveries since the second week, offering the knowledge of 40 years with the calm generosity of someone who understood that knowledge was meant to move forward, not stop. One morning, in the 5th week, Arvelda had looked at Vilena's growing shape with a thoughtful expression and said, very calmly, "1 or 2, do you think?" Vilena had stared at her. Arvelda had simply smiled and gone back to measuring dried chamomile. 2. She had been moving toward that certainty for weeks without letting herself land on it fully. Now, lying awake at night with both hands spread on her abdomen and the fire burning low, she felt them both. 2 separate presences. 2 distinct rhythms of movement, sometimes at the same moment and sometimes hours apart. She had pressed her face into her pillow more than once, and simply breathed through the knowledge of it, that she was carrying 2 lives, alone, in a fog-wrapped coastal village under a borrowed name, and that their father did not know they existed. The merchant arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd month. He was the kind of man who travelled between villages, selling fabric and information in roughly equal measure, and he set up at the corner of the market square with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Vilena was buying dried ginger from the spice seller across the way when she heard him start talking. She made herself stay still. She kept her face turned toward the ginger. The Alpha King of Kingswell had gone strange, the merchant said. Strange was the word he kept using, because it was the only word that covered everything. Crops failing in 3 provinces, not from drought, not from blight, but from something no one had a name for, as though the land itself was uncertain what season it was. Pack wolves going feral in daylight, which had not been seen in living memory. His Majesty deploying his entire personal guard across every border of the kingdom. Searching, the merchant said, for a woman. He had a description: common height, dark hair, dark eyes, gifted healer, a reward of 8,000 gold pieces for any information leading to her discovery. 8,000. Vilena bought the ginger. She thanked the spice seller by name. She walked back to her cottage at the exact same pace she always walked, which was deliberate and unhurried, and she nodded to Berta Coldridge on the way past, with the easy nod of a neighbour with nothing on her mind. She closed the cottage door. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, her bag of ginger in her lap, and she looked at the opposite wall for a very long time. Why would a man who chose another woman deploy an entire army searching for the one he discarded? She did not let herself answer, or she took the question, and she set it carefully in the part of her mind that held the things she could not afford to examine yet, the same part where she kept the image of his flat, amber eyes, the sound of Lysera's name, and the picture of him raising another woman's hand to his lips in the blazing light of the great hall, while Vailina broke apart in the dark gallery above. That night, the mark on her collarbone burned so fiercely that she came awake with a gasp, sitting upright in the narrow bed with the winter dark pressing in from all sides. She pressed her hand to it. Through the heat, through the scar, through whatever it was the bond had become in its broken state. She felt something she hadn't felt in 3 months. A presence, not her own, not a dream. Searching, desperate, as exhausted in the way of someone who had not stopped moving in a very long time. She pressed her lips together. She lay back down. She did not reach back. She was not ready to reach back, was not certain she ever would be. But she lay there with her hand on her collarbone and her eyes open in the dark, and she thought about a word she had not let herself think in 3 months. Why? She saw them at the tree line just before dusk. The fog had thinned in the late afternoon, the way it occasionally did, pulling back from the cliffs in ribbons and revealing the scrubby pines that marked the edge of the village on the inland side. She was in the cottage garden, cutting the last of the winter herbs before the coming frost finished them, and she looked up and saw shapes moving in the shadows between the trees. Large shapes, 4-legged, too low to the ground, amber-eyed, too intelligent to be strays. She set down her shears. She went inside. She left the door open 6 inches and stood to one side of it, where she would not be visible from the garden, and she waited with her hand resting on the iron poker by the hearth. They came to the door 5 minutes later, 2 of them shifting to human form in the shadows of the cottage path, moving with the particular contained awareness of trained wolves who were trying very hard to look like they were not trained wolves, and behind them, walking with his hands visible and his chin slightly down, came a man she recognized. Silver-streaked hair, weathered face, amber eyes that found her through the gap in the door and landed on her with something so close to relief that it hurt to see. Jorvik Ironheart, Varric's first beta. She opened the door fully. She let them in. She kept the iron poker in her hand. She did not sit, and she did not offer tea, and she held Jorvik's gaze with an expression that said everything she was choosing not to say out loud, that she had been 3 months without a word, that she had survived those months by building walls fast enough to stay ahead of what was chasing her, and that she would not dismantle those walls for anything less than the entire truth. He did not rush her. He stood in the center of the cottage with his hat in his hands and his face open, and he started talking. He started with the morning after the choosing. Varric had woken on the floor of his own chamber with no memory of the preceding 4 days. None. Not the choosing ceremony, not Lysera's name, not the moment at the dais, not the celebration that followed. He had come to consciousness on the cold stone floor of his chamber in the grey hour before dawn, and the first thing he had said, before his eyes were even fully open, the first coherent thing that came out of him, was her name. Then, where is she? Jorvik told her this with the flat calm of a man reporting something that was still not real to him, even now, months later. A compound had been introduced to Varric's ceremonial cup on the night of the choosing, derived from a rare coastal root found only in the northern marshes, one that healers used, in diluted form, to calm aggression in badly injured wolves. In concentrated form, introduced to a specific ceremonial vessel, it did something else entirely. It suppressed the wolf. It severed the bond connection. It left the man standing where the wolf should have been, now stripped of his instincts, stripped of his recognition, stripped of everything that would have made him point at the hall and say her name instead of Lysera's. For 4 days. By the time the compound wore off, she was already gone. Jorvik stopped talking. He looked at his hat. Vailina stood very still, with the iron poker in her hand, and the familiar, terrible silence of a person choosing their next words carefully. "That is," she said, "a very convenient story." He looked up. "I know," he said. "A story that excuses everything. A story shaped perfectly to explain away every piece of evidence I have spent 3 months accepting." "I know what it sounds like," he said. "I would not ask you to believe it because I am asking you to. I am asking you to look at what I brought." He reached into his coat. He placed a folded letter on her work table, with the careful movements of a man setting down something that might explode. The seal was Ravencrest, dark red wax pressed with the serpent crest of House Ravencrest. And it was broken, the wax cracked across in the way of a letter that had been opened by someone other than its intended recipient. She looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then she picked it up. It was short. 4 lines. The handwriting was precise and slanted, the kind trained into sons and daughters of noble houses. The last line read, "The obstacle has been located. It will not survive the next full moon." She set it back down on the table. She stood there for a moment that stretched out longer than moments usually did, holding the weight of what had just shifted, of the story she had been living in for 3 months, the one where he had looked at her and found her insufficient, where he had done the arithmetic of power and chosen correctly. That story had crumbled. Not dramatically. Just quietly, like a wall that has been damp too long finally settling into the ground. What replaced it was not simpler. She had not been discarded. She had been stolen from. Which was, in its own way, harder, because it meant the grief she had been carrying had been built on a lie. And now she had to grieve all over again, for the version of events she had believed, and for the real one underneath it, and both of them were losses, and she was very tired. She set the poker down. She sat. Jorvik did not speak. He understood what sitting meant. After a while, she asked, "How is he?" Jorvik pressed his mouth together for a moment. Then he said, "He has not slept in 93 days. His wolf is losing the fight for control. He has cleared 2 war councils out of rooms simply by entering them. If he does not find you—" A pause. "If he does not find you soon, we will not lose him to politics, my lady. We will lose him to the animal." She looked at her hands. The baby moved, or the babies moved, a slow, rolling shift that started on the left side and resolved on the right. She felt it the way she always felt it, like a question being asked from very far inside. She thought about a man waking up on a cold floor. She thought about 93 days. She thought about a howl she had not been there to hear, but that somehow, in some part of her that she had not known, was still listening. She had felt. "Step outside," she said. "Give me a few minutes." Jorvik nodded. He rose. He moved to the door with his 2 soldiers and stepped out into the gathering dark, and the door closed softly behind him. Alone in her cottage, Vailina placed both hands on her abdomen and sat with the quiet. She reached, tentatively, the way you reach for something in the dark when you are not sure what you will touch. through the crescent mark on her collarbone, through whatever remained of the bond between them. She had not reached in 3 months. She had been too afraid of what she might find, or of what she might not find. She found him immediately, exhausted, frantic. The particular desperation of a wolf that has been searching for too long and has not yet permitted itself to stop. Alive, looking for her with every breath he had. Or she sat there for a long time, with her hands on her abdomen, and the fire low, and the sound of the sea below the cliffs, and she thought about walls, about the ones she had built, and what they had cost her, and what it would cost her to take them down. She thought about 2 small lives that deserved a father. She stood up. She opened the door. "All right," she said to Jorvik, who turned from the darkness with an expression of barely controlled relief. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." Jorvik was still talking when the tree line exploded. Not figuratively. The pines at the edge of the village road simply erupted. Branches snapping, something large and fast pouring through them, not one shape but several, while moving with the coordinated silence of a hunting pack that had done this before and knew exactly where each of them was supposed to be. Dark wolves, bigger than average, moving without hesitation toward the cottage. Jorvik was on his feet before the first branch finished falling, his 2 soldiers shifting mid-stride with the speed of wolves who had been waiting for this, the sound of it splitting the quiet evening air like 2 stones cracking together. "Get to the cellar," Jorvik said, his voice flat with the specific calm of someone suppressing every instinct that was not useful right now. Verlina looked at the tree line, counted moving shapes, counted again. She picked up the knife from the work table. "Verlina, I heard you," she said. She went to the cellar door. She opened it. She looked down at the dark below, and then she looked back at Jorvik's wolf form, silver-streaked and already bleeding from a cut above his left eye, from a dark wolf that had circled faster than either of them expected. She stood there with the cellar door in her hand, listening to 3 wolves fight in her garden, and she thought about the months she had spent being careful, being small, making herself invisible so that nothing and no one could reach the lives she was protecting. Then she heard the sound, bone on bark, a single sharp crack, and Jorvik's wolf shape thrown against the pine at the edge of the garden with a force that shook the needles from its branches. He hit the ground hard. 3 dark wolves circled him immediately, patient and certain, like wolves who knew they had already won. He was not getting up. Novaelina set the knife down. She stepped outside. She had been suppressing it since childhood, the light that lived in the space between her palms, the warm gold thing that she had no name for, because she had never permitted herself to name it. Her mother had told her, once, to keep it hidden. Her mother had not explained why, and had died before Verlina could ask, and so Verlina had simply kept it hidden, the way she kept everything else hidden, carefully, constantly, with the exhausting discipline of someone who understood that being seen completely was dangerous. She was very tired of hiding. The light rose between her palms without her asking it to. Not the small, careful things she had occasionally allowed herself late at night, alone. This was full and blazing and warm as noon, and it moved outward from her like a sound, like a note struck on a bell, and every wolf in the garden went still. She walked to Jorvik. She pressed her palms to his sides, where the ribs had shifted wrong, where the blood was soaking into the grey of his fur, and she let the light do what it had always wanted to do. She felt the ribs move back. She felt the blood slow. She felt his heart, frantic beneath her hands, begin to find its rhythm. Jorvik's eyes opened. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on a wolf's face before, which was something between shock and a very particular kind of gratitude that had no easy translation. One of the dark wolves lunged at her from the left side. She had not decided to respond. The light did it before she did. A wave of it, warm and sudden and forceful, and the wolf yelped and hit the ground rolling, its fur steaming faintly, its expression considerably more uncertain than it had been a moment ago. The others held their positions. A voice came from the tree line, human and female, and utterly composed. Interesting. The figure stepped out of the shadows, masked, wolf skull carved from pale wood, a crossbow levelled at Valina's centre of mass, with the casual ease of someone who had been doing this long enough that it did not require effort any more. "House Ravencrest will want to know," the figure continued, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone reporting a fact, "that the king's woman is a light wielder." Her finger tightened on the crossbow. The forest behind her came apart. The sound arrived first, not the controlled snap of trained wolves entering through the trees, but something else, entirely. Something that had no care for control, but something massive and furious and moving so fast that the dark wolves at the cottage garden turned toward it in the same instant, and none of them were fast enough. A wolf the size of a destrier crossed the clearing in a single bound. Black fur, eyes like gold fire, moving the way unstoppable things move, not fast exactly, but inevitable, the kind of speed that comes from something that has already decided and is simply completing the decision. He was between Valina and the masked figure before the crossbow had finished swinging. The fight that followed was brief in the way that fights are brief when one side has been looking for a reason for 3 months and has finally found it. Valina stayed where she was, her palms still warm, Jorvik regaining his feet slowly beside her, and she watched the dark wolves scatter, and then, one by one, to stop. The masked figure was the last. She was held still by 2 of Varric's wolves, her crossbow in pieces on the frozen ground, her mask on the ground beside it. The face beneath it was young, younger than Valina had expected, with pale hair and cold eyes and the precise bone structure of House Ravencrest. Jorvik walked to her. He looked at her face. Something moved through his expression that was not surprise. "Zivara Ravencrest," he said quietly, "Lizara's younger sister." The young woman said nothing. Her eyes were on Violina, steady and measuring as though she was completing a calculation and was mildly irritated by the answer. Violina understood, in that moment, what the letter had meant. What it had always meant. House Ravencrest had not simply wanted the throne through a political marriage, and they had been willing to send their own blood, their own daughter, their own wolf, to protect it. This was not a hired killing. This was a family decision. The world was much simpler and much more dangerous than she had allowed herself to believe. The black wolf stood at the edge of the garden, watching her. She watched him back. He shifted, the form folding inward, the wolf becoming the man, enormous and dark-haired, and standing in the frozen garden in the night air with his hands at his sides and his gold eyes fixed on her face with an expression she had seen only once before, which was the expression of someone who has found the thing they were most afraid of losing and cannot quite believe it is real. He moved toward her, slowly. His hands came up. They stopped, hovering, not touching, over the curve of her abdomen. He did not touch. He asked. His voice was fractured in the way of something that had been held under too much pressure for too long. "May I?" She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his face, at the shadows under his eyes, at the rawness in his expression, at the amber eyes that were nothing like flat or distant now. He looked like a man who had been awake for 3 months. She reached out. She took his hands, both of them large and shaking slightly, and she pressed them, gently to where the twins had just begun to move. He went completely still. His breath came out of him in a sound that was not quite a word and not quite anything else. And then he was on his knees in the snow, his forehead bowed, his hands spread wide, and his shoulders shook once. Vailina stood in the cold night air with her palms cupped lightly over his hands and let him have that moment, because it seemed like something that had been building for 93 days and could not be rushed. The snow around them had gone perfectly quiet. Even the wolves had stopped moving. After a while, without lifting his head, he said her name. Not loudly, not as a question. The way you say a word you have been repeating to yourself in the dark for so long that saying it in the light is the strangest thing you have ever done. She said, "I know." That was all for now, but it was enough to begin. He lifted her onto the saddle before she could argue about it. She had opened her mouth. He had simply taken her by the waist, carefully, with the hands of a man who was terrified of being too rough, and lifted her up, and then swung up behind her and wrapped one arm around her middle in the particular way of a wolf who needed contact, the way a drowning person needed something solid to hold. "My wolf needs you close," he said, against her hair. 3 months of that. I will not apologize for this. She had not argued. They rode north through the night and then turned south with the first light, with Jorvik and the soldiers flanking them at a respectful distance, and the sound of the coast slowly giving way to the sound of the inland roads. Vailina sat in the curve of his arm and let herself feel the warmth of his chest at her back and the steadiness of his heartbeat, and tried to put herself back together around those facts. He told her. He had clearly been waiting 3 months to tell her, and he did it the way that people do things they have rehearsed in the dark, in pieces, not in order, the important parts arriving before the connective tissue. He told her about waking on the floor. He told her about the empty 4 days. Not blank, exactly, but wrong, like trying to remember a dream in daylight. He told her about Lysera standing in his chamber that first morning with a composed expression and a suggestion about the coronation timeline, and how he had looked at her and felt nothing except a profound and immediate certainty that something was deeply wrong. He had thrown her out of his chambers, he said, with considerably less grace than was appropriate. She had gone, because even Lysera Ravencrest understood when a situation had changed. He told her about the investigation that followed, the frantic, disbelieving days of trying to piece together what had happened, of calling in healers who examined him with careful hands and cautious expressions, and said words like suppression and compound and bond severance, and watched him carefully to see how he would receive it. He told her about the moment Jorvik had placed the first piece of evidence on the table, a small vial of dried residue recovered from the ceremonial goblet, and the way the room had gone completely still. He told her about the search, about the maps spread across every surface of the war room, the wolf teams deployed to every border crossing and coastal road, the reward posters going up in market squares from one end of the kingdom to the other. About the way his control frayed, day by day, his wolf pressing against the inside of him with increasing desperation as the weeks accumulated, and she was not found. "My council was afraid of me," he said, without particular expression. "By the 2nd month, some of them wouldn't enter a room alone with me. I understood why. Then he had spent 93 days dismantling the kingdom, looking for Vailina. She turned this over. 8,000 gold pieces. His entire personal guard. 3 provinces in some kind of sympathy distress. The land, apparently, responding to the incomplete bond the way a body responded to a severed nerve. "Your wolf," she said. Jorvik said it was losing control. He was quiet for a moment. The arm around her tightened slightly, Not possessively but steadily, the adjustment of something that needed grounding. "My wolf," he said slowly, "Tesh was convinced that you were in danger, that you had been taken. It is not entirely wrong, in retrospect." "No," she agreed, "not entirely." She listened to the road. She listened to the sound of his breathing, which was steadier than it had been in the cottage garden, and thought about a wolf that had spent 3 months in a state of crisis, because the thing it had claimed was gone. She told him her side then. She told him about the walk through the servants' corridors with shaking hands and one bag. She told him about the North Road and the farmhouse, and the long, dark weeks of settling into a borrowed name. She told him about Dunmare, about Arvelda and Berta, and the deliveries and the broken arm and the way a small village wraps itself around a useful person, whether they want it to or not. She told him about the night the first one moved, and what she had said in the dark to the child she had not yet known was 2. He said nothing for a long time after that. Just the arm, steady around her. Just the heartbeat at her back. Then he said, "I want to hear them." She knew what he meant. Not now, on horseback in the dark, but eventually. The voices, the first sounds, the everything that he had not been present for. "You will," she said. She had been looking forward at the dark road for a long time. Then she said it, not looking at him, eyes forward. The way she had found was easier for the things that cost the most. "I loved you through all of it. Even when I was certain you had destroyed me. I need you to know that before we reach whatever is waiting for us at the end of this road." The arm around her pulled her a fraction closer. He pressed his lips to her hair. He held them there. "I will spend," he said, quiet and unhurried, "whatever years I have left, being worthy of that." She let herself lean into him. The crescent mark on her collarbone, which had been burning since the night she left, and aching for 3 months, and blazing since the moment he stepped into the clearing, went warm and still and almost peaceful. They reached the river crossing just after dawn. He pulled the horse to a stop. He turned her face toward his with one hand, gentle, asking, and she let him, and when they finally kissed, it was the kiss of 2 people who had been building toward it through a winter and a betrayal, and a long, cold night on a coastal road, and both of them were unsteady when they broke apart. The crescent mark blazed, not painfully, with recognition, like a door swinging open that had been closed for too long. She pressed her fingers to his jaw and looked at him in the grey morning light and thought, "There you are. Finally. There you are." Then one of the scouts came riding hard down the road from the south. His face was white. "My king." He pulled his horse up short, his voice controlled only through effort. "Lord Calix Ravencrest declared himself regent at midnight. He has seized the castle. Lysera has been crowned." A breath. "And 39 wolves who refused to kneel are to be executed before noon." Verlina felt the warmth between them turn very cold. She thought of Maren, the kitchen elder, soft-spoken and round-faced, who had always left a small loaf of warm bread outside Verlina's door when she arrived on cold mornings without comment or expectation, who had called her dear in the easy, generous way of a woman who had love to spare. She thought of 38 others like her. She turned to Varric. She did not wait for him to speak. "We go in," she said. "Now." He looked at her for one moment with that expression, the one she was beginning to recognize as the face he made when he was placing her ahead of every calculation he had trained himself to make. "Now," he said. He turned the horse south. Kingswell was burning. Not the whole city, not yet, but 3/4 of the merchant district had smoke rising from them. grey and thick in the morning air, and the royal banner had been torn from the castle gate. In its place flew the silver serpent of House Ravencrest, long and pale against the sky, looking exactly as satisfied as its lord had intended. Varric's wolves hit the outer gates at speed. The Ravencrest soldiers who held the walls had numbers. What they didn't have was the particular quality of fury that comes from a wolf army whose king has been in a controlled state of rage for 3 months and has finally been given something useful to do with it. The outer walls lasted less than an hour. The city streets were faster. Velina rode through it in the middle of the formation with Jorvik's wolves flanking her, and she watched Kingswell return to itself, merchants emerging from doorways, city wolves shifting back to human form in the streets, the Ravencrest serpent banner coming down tower by tower. The city recognized its king. It always had. Some loyalties run too deep for an overnight coup to shift. The castle was harder. Lord Calix Ravencrest had 2 advantages: walls and 39 lives. He had barricaded himself in the great throne hall with his hostages before dawn, which told Violina that he had known the coup might not hold. He had planned for this contingency. The hall was defensible, the walls were thick, and he had Varric's people on their knees inside it as insurance. Varric's wolves took up positions around every entrance. They settled in, and they waited, because Varric was a strategist, even through 3 months of controlled fury, and he knew the difference between a siege and a trap. Violina was supposed to wait on the hillside above the city with Jorvik. She had been sitting on the hillside for 11 minutes when she stood up, or Jorvik turned to look at her with an expression that she recognized as the expression of a wolf who already knows what is about to happen and has no idea what to do about it. "If I go in through the servants' entrance," she said, "and present myself to Calix before Varric positions his wolves to storm the hall, Calix has a reason to let the hostages go. He wants me more than he wants 39 kitchen wolves and elders." Jorvik stared at her. "His Majesty," he said carefully, "will do what he did to the last 2 people who suggested something like this, which is—" "Tell him after," she said. She was already moving. She knew the servants' entrance the way she knew every secondary door of the castle, from years of being the kind of person who was expected to use them. The passage was dark and smelled of old stone, and she moved through it with the ease of someone going home by a route they have taken 100 times. She emerged through a low side door into the throne hall. 39 wolves knelt in a line before the dais. Some of them had their hands bound. Most of them were watching the floor. Calix Ravencrest sat in the throne that did not belong to him, casual, deliberate, his long legs stretched before him like a man at rest. He was older than she had expected, grey at the temples, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something else over the years of wanting things he did not have. Lysera stood at his shoulder in the crown that had been placed on her head the night before. She looked at Velina with an expression that was not triumph. It was something quieter than that, and harder to read. And Maren was there, at the near end of the hostage line, round-faced and grey-haired, looking up from the floor with eyes that went wide when she saw Velina. Her lips parted. "Run, child," Maren said, very quietly. "Please run." Velina looked at her. She felt the old warmth of 100 cold mornings and a loaf of warm bread left without comment. "I am done running," she said. Calix turned his gaze toward her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Adjustment. Recalculation. She walked to the center of the hall. She kept her voice clear and her hands visible, and she made her offer the way she had thought it through on the hillside. Simply, completely, with the particular weight of a person who has decided and will not be undecided. She was the true queen, not by title but by bond, by blood, and by the heirs she carried. She was worth more to him alive than 39 wolves combined. She would give herself to him as a hostage, willingly, in exchange for every person in that line, walking out through the hall doors right now. The silence was very complete. Calix considered her. "Done," he said. The hostage line rose. Jorvik's wolves, who had apparently arrived at the side doors while she was speaking, because Jorvik was not the kind of beta who simply accepted, "Tell him after," guided them out. Maren passed close to Vailina and pressed her fingers briefly to her hand as she went, saying nothing, her eyes saying everything. The great doors closed. Vailina stood in the middle of the throne hall with Calix Ravencrest and his daughter and 6 of his wolves, and she breathed steadily, and she waited. Calix rose from the throne. He moved with the ease of a man who has already completed his calculation and is simply resolving the final step. He picked up the sword that had been resting against the arm of the throne. The blade caught the torchlight strangely, too bright, slicked with something that was not oil. "A dead hostage," Calix said pleasantly, "still solves my problem." The wolf's bane on the blade was visible at this distance, that faint silver sheen that coated weapons specifically designed to end wolves who would not end otherwise. She had one breath of stillness before it happened. The babies moved, not the small, shifting roll she had come to know. Something different, something that rose from the deepest part of her, older than the bond, older than the mark, older than anything she had a name for, and it did not ask permission. It simply moved through her like the first breath of spring through a door that has been closed all winter, and every bone in her body broke and remade itself in the span of 30 seconds. It was agony. It was also the most true she had ever felt in her own skin. She rose from the stone floor as a wolf, silver pale, the color of sea foam and winter light, the color of the coast she had called home for 3 months, and her eyes were blazing amber, and the crescent mark on her throat glowed like an ember. Calix stepped back. Lysera said nothing. The side doors came off their hinges. Varric came through them in wolf form, enormous, black, gold-eyed, and there was nothing complicated or strategic about what followed. There was simply the truth of a king and a queen in the hall where everything had started, and the resolution of everything that House Ravencrest had set in motion. It was swift, it was complete, it was not cruel. Neither of them was cruel, and cruelty was not the point. When it was over, Calix Ravencrest was on his knees, with Varric's wolves at his back, and his sword in pieces on the floor. Lysera stood where she had stood throughout, silent, still, the crown heavy on her head. Varric shifted back to human. He stood in the center of the throne hall, breathing hard, and he looked at Lysera with the flat, formal calm of a man closing a door that should have been closed months ago. "The choosing that night was not made by me," he said. "It was made by the compound your house introduced to my cup. A man who was not present cannot have made a choice. The choosing is void. It always was." Lysera said nothing. She lifted the crown from her own head, which Vailina thought showed a kind of dignity, and set it on the arm of the throne. She walked out of the hall without speaking. In the silence that followed, Varric turned to Vailina. She was still in wolf form, catching her breath, learning the shape of herself. She had never been a wolf before, never allowed it, never trusted herself enough, never believed she could hold it and stay herself. She was herself, entirely, completely herself, and also this, silver and blazing-eyed and real. He tilted his head. It was the oldest gesture in wolf tradition. Not a bow, not a kneel, a baring of the throat, the most vulnerable place, the place where a claiming mark was given and taken, to a true mate. Total surrender, total trust. "Claim me," he said, his voice low and steady, "or make it real." She shifted back to human in the space of a breath. She crossed the floor. She pressed her lips to the hollow of his throat, where the pulse was strong and fast, and entirely his, and she felt the bond between them, which had been severed and strained and stretched across 3 months of a winter she would not repeat, finally, completely close. The resonance that moved through the castle and out into the city was not a sound exactly. It was more like a pressure change, the way the air shifts when a storm that has been building for a long time finally breaks, and the breaking is a relief. From outside the walls, from the streets and the squares and the hillsides surrounding Kingswell, the wolves of the city lifted their heads, and then they howled, not in alarm, not in battle, but in the old way, the deep way, or the way wolves howl when something that was lost has finally come home. Justice, when it came, was not loud. Vailina had expected something more dramatic. She had been raised on stories of trials and declarations, and the clash of powerful families meeting their ends in public spectacle. What she saw instead was Varek at a long oak table in the council hall, with pack elders and witnesses arranged on both sides, and the quiet, methodical presentation of evidence that had been assembled over 3 months of searching. The compound, the letter intercepted by Jorvik, the testimony of 3 Ravencrest servants who had witnessed the preparation of the ceremonial cup and had spent 3 months being afraid to say so. Lord Calix Ravencrest did not deny it. Vailina thought there was something almost relieved about him, was in the end the particular relief of a man who has been running a game too complex to maintain and has finally been allowed to stop. His sentence was exile to the far eastern territories, stripped of title and Wolfright and the Ravencrest name. He was given provisions and a direction and no return date. Lysera was handled differently, and the decision was Vailina's to make. Varek had made that clear without making a production of it. He had simply, in the council chamber, turned to her with the expression of a man deferring to the person whose judgment he trusted most. She had thought about it for a long time. Lysera had not killed anyone, had not sent assassins. That had been Zivara, and Zivara was facing a separate accounting. Lysera had accepted a situation that had been engineered for her, had worn a crown that had been placed on her head, had stood in a hall and allowed things to happen around her, and had not, in the end, raised the sword herself. Vailina had known what it was to be caught in a situation that other people had made. She was not without mercy. Lysera was given what Vailina had been given, a borrowed name and the chance to build something from nothing, exile to the northern coast. No title, no Wolfright, no Ravencrest behind her name. She was also given something Vailina had not been given, which was the truth, plainly stated, before she left. That the man she had been installed to marry had never chosen her, and that the situation she had stood in had been built by her father's hands, and that none of that was something she had to carry if she chose not to. Lysera had looked at Vailina for a long moment with the unreadable expression she always had. Then she had said, "You are more generous than I would be." Perhaps, Vailina had said, "I had good reason to learn what it costs to carry something you do not have to carry." Lysera had left without responding, but she had left differently than Vailina had expected, not with the cold precision of a woman retreating, but with the slightly undone look of someone in the middle of reconsidering things. Vailina had watched her go and thought, "That is the best I can do. That will have to be enough." The kingdom healed in the way that things heal when the wound has been treated properly. Not all at once, not without scarring, but steadily and with purpose. The crops in the eastern provinces recovered within weeks of the bond completing, which even the most skeptical of the pack elders had no good explanation for, except the one that Wolflaw had always provided, that a land mirrors its king, and a king mirrors his bond. The feral wolves returned to themselves. The sea roots opened again. Kingswell, which had been holding its breath for 3 months, began to exhale. Velina did not simply become queen the way that a piece is moved on a board. She became queen the way she had become essential in Dunmer, gradually through the accumulation of real things. She sat in councils and said what she thought, and was sometimes right and sometimes revised, and was never small about either. She continued to practice her healing craft, which some of the older advisers found peculiar, and which Varek defended in council with the kind of flat certainty that did not invite discussion. She brought the light-wielding out into the open too, which was the harder thing. There were wolves in the kingdom who had gifts like hers, suppressed, unnamed, hidden away in the quiet parts of themselves for exactly the same reasons she had hidden hers. She did not make speeches about it. She simply stopped hiding, and let that be the speech. One by one, over the following months, other wolves began to find her. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way people come to something when they have been waiting for permission and have finally been given it. Carefully, hopefully, watching to see what would happen to the first few before deciding whether it was safe to follow. She received each of them in the East Garden, which she had taken back for herself and planted with everything useful she could find. She listened to them. She answered their questions honestly, including the ones she did not have complete answers to. She told them, "This is a thing you are, not a thing you have done wrong." She also quietly arranged for the village of Dunmer to receive a new school. Lumber and coin delivered one morning before dawn, with no letter and no ceremony, just materials and a note in a hand that Berta Coldridge would have recognized if she had known whose handwriting to look for. She wrote to Arvelda, who wrote back with characteristic economy. "Pleased for you. The fishing has been good." The coronation was on a clear morning in the first week after winter broke. She had been asked about a gown, about a procession, about the traditional white dress, and the traditional route through the great hall from the main doors to the dais, while she had listened politely to all of it. Then she had chosen deep green, the color of things that were growing, that had been through a winter and were still growing, and she had arranged to enter from the side, the servants' entrance, the small door off the east corridor, the one she had used every morning for years before anyone in the great hall had known her name. The door that opened directly onto the lower side of the hall, where the heating vents were, and the floor showed the most wear, and the torches had to be replaced most often, because they were always being carried back and forth. She remembered, clearly, every morning she had come through that door with her arms full of herbs and her head down, not looking at the great hall, because looking at it had never been her place to do. While she remembered the first time she had looked up, actually looked, as a person looks at something they are allowed to look at, and seen the full length of it. The pillars and the banners and the high vaulted ceiling, and the light that came down through the upper windows in the morning and made the stone floor glow like something living. She had stood there for 3 seconds, looking, and then she had gone back to carrying herbs, because looking was one thing and staying was another. Now she was staying. The court was very quiet as she came in. She had not told anyone the plan except Varek, who had looked at her with that expression, the one she had come to love without reservation, and said only, "Of course." She walked in through the servants' door with her chin up, and the green dress catching the early light, and the crescent mark visible at her collarbone, silver and permanent, and a record of everything they had survived. She walked the length of the hall at the pace of someone who was not hurrying, because she had earned the right to take her time. The court watched her come. She could see them processing it, the entrance, the door, the choice she had made, and what it meant. Some of them had been in the castle long enough to recognize the door. Vailina watched the understanding move through their faces, one by one, the way a stone dropped in still water moves outward in circles. Near the back of the hall, silver-haired and standing a little straighter than usual, Jorvik watched her come. He bowed. Not the shallow bow of a courtier performing protocol, the deep bow of a wolf who understood what the gesture meant, and meant every degree of it. The court followed, one by one, and then all at once, like a wave moving through a field. She let herself feel it. The twins arrived on an evening in late spring when the windows of the castle were open for the first time, and the air smelled of something green and warm, and Arvelda Thornwell, who had travelled from Dunmere specifically for this, and whom Vailina had not argued with, because some arguments were not worth having, delivered them both with the calm efficiency of a woman who had done this 400 times, and found it no less extraordinary for that. A boy first, or dark-haired like his father, with careful hands that were already, somehow, gentle even in the first moments, already reaching. A girl 20 minutes later, who shifted in the first hour of her life, her small wolf form appearing, and then resolving back as though she was still deciding which shape she preferred. Silver pale when she was wolf, eyes blazing amber when she opened them, looking up at the room with an expression of absolute, focused attention that Vailina recognized immediately as something that had come from both of them and belonged entirely to her. Varric held both of them with the focused terror of a man who had survived battles and been undone by two small, sleeping faces. He held them the way he held everything he cared about, with total attention, with complete stillness, with the hands of someone who understood the weight of what they were carrying. Vailina watched him from the pillow. The room was quiet. The window was open. The spring air moved through it gently. She reached up and traced the crescent scar on her collarbone with 2 fingers. It was healed, fully, completely healed, silver and permanent and precise. Not aching, not burning, not reaching, just there, just warm. You could have told me sooner, Varric said softly, without taking his eyes from the babies. About the child, about the mark hurting, about all of it. She considered this. You could have come sooner, she said. He looked at her. Then he laughed, low and real and completely helpless, the laugh of a man who has been very serious for a very long time and has been given permission, finally, to stop. Fair, he said. Not completely fair. She held out her hand. He shifted one of the babies, the boy who was already making the small, determined sounds of someone who had things to say, into the crook of his arm, and took her hand with his free one. His fingers wrapped around hers. She looked at the window, at the late spring sky going gold and deep rose, at the light moving over the stones of the city below, at the kingdom they would spend their lives building and protecting and making worthy of the people in it. She thought about the servants' corridor, and the frosted window, and the bonfires below, and the cold glass under her fingers on the worst night of her life. She thought about a north road, and a fog-wrapped coast, and a borrowed name, and a promise made in the dark to 2 small lives. Or she thought about a man in the snow, with his forehead bowed, and his hands spread wide, and his shoulders shaking once. She thought about a wolf the colour of sea foam, rising from cold stone, and learning the shape of itself. Outside, very softly, the wolves of Kingswell were howling, not the raw, broken sound that had split the sky on the night she walked away, not the battle cry of wolves who had come through a siege and were still standing. Something quieter than both of those. The sound of an evening settling into itself. The sound of a city breathing. Vailina closed her eyes. The crescent mark on her collarbone was warm and still and present. Not burning, not searching, not aching with the absence of anything. Just home. Just whole. Just here, at last, exactly where she had always been going.